In the first hard freeze of 1889, the cold inside Martha Avery's cabin did not come through the door. It came up from the floor. Every morning before the sun touched the pines, her children woke with their knees tucked to their chests. Ruth was 9. Ben was 6. Their blankets were stiff at the edges. Their breath hung white above the bed like smoke that had nowhere to go. Martha could keep a fire alive. She could split cedar until her hands bled, feed the stove every hour, pack rags into window cracks, and still lose the fight by dawn. Because the wind had found the one place she could not shut. Under the cabin, the house stood on short stone piers above the frozen ground, just high enough for air to run beneath it. At night, that narrow space became a blade. It cut through the plank floor. It turned warm rooms into cold boxes. It made the children cough before breakfast. And by the second week of November, Martha understood something nobody wanted to say out loud. If she only fought the weather from above, she was going to lose her children from below. The cabin sat on a lonely rise near the St. Joe River in Idaho Territory, 16 feet by 20 feet. One iron cookstove, one rough table, one bed for Martha, one rope bed for the children, pushed into the north corner because that was the only place the roof did not leak. Her husband, Elias, had died that spring beneath a rolling log on a timber slope. He left behind an axe, a little unpaid credit at Foster's Mercantile, and a cabin that looked sound from the road. But winter does not judge a house from the road. Winter tests the seams. The first seams failed under the floor. Martha tried what people told her to try. She nailed feed sacks along the base of the cabin. She packed straw between the piers. She dragged brush against the windward side. She burned nearly a quarter cord of wood in 10 days. Nothing held. The water pail froze in the corner. A skin of ice formed inside the wash basin. Ben's cough moved deeper into his chest. Ruth stopped taking off her mittens even when she ate. One night, after both children finally fell asleep, Martha knelt beside their bed and laid her palm flat on the floorboards. The planks were colder than the wall, not cool, not drafty. Cold enough that it felt as if the earth itself was pulling the life out of the room. She stayed there a long time, listening to the wind saw through the crawl space beneath her knees. Then she remembered a place Elias had once shown her behind an old mining camp, a storage pit cut into a slope, covered with poles and earth. In July, the pit stayed cool. In January, he had said, it stayed warmer than the air. At the time, Martha thought it was just minor talk. Now it sounded like the only honest thing anyone had ever said about winter. The next morning, before Ruth and Ben woke, Martha pried up 2 floorboards in the north corner. Underneath was black, hard soil. She did not own an engineer's book. She did not have a mason. She did not have a man from town to approve the idea. She had a shovel, and she had one fact that mattered. 5 feet down, the ground did not follow the storm. In that part of the mountains, the air could fall below 0 for days, but the earth beneath the frost line held near 45 degrees, still cold for comfort, warm for survival. And if a small pocket of earth could borrow a little heat from the cabin above, stone could hold that heat through the night. Martha did not call it earth sheltering. She called it making a place the wind could not enter. So she began. At first she dug only when the children were asleep. Then she dug while they gathered kindling. Then she dug whenever there was enough daylight to see the shovel bite. The hole was not large, 7 feet long, 5 feet wide, just deep enough for her to sit upright with her back against the wall. She planned it beneath the children's bed, where the cold punished them most. Every spadeful went into a flour sack. Every flour sack went outside, and every load of dirt was scattered thin across the frozen garden, kicked under brush, or mixed with ash behind the woodshed, so nobody passing the road would wonder why a widow was digging a grave-sized room under her own house. By the 4th day, the soil softened. By the 9th day, her hands tore open. By the 12th, Ruth caught her climbing out through the floor. "What are you making?" the girl whispered. Martha looked at the dirt on her skirt, the shovel in her hand, and the little square of darkness where the floor had been. "A sleeping place," she said. Ruth looked down. "In the ground," Martha answered, "where the ground keeps its own weather." That was the first time she said the idea aloud. It sounded foolish even to her. But the hole kept growing. When she reached the depth she wanted, Martha hauled river stones from the creek bed. Flat ones for the lower courses, round ones for the side walls, small wedge stones to lock the gaps. She stacked without mortar, because mortar cost money she did not have. She packed bark, dry moss, and cedar needles between the stones and the earth. She laid split poles overhead beneath the floorboards to keep loose dirt from sifting down. She cut a narrow vent through the outer sill and disguised it beneath a slanted scrap of tin as if it were drainage. The chamber was ugly. It was cramped. It smelled of damp rock and cedar. But when Martha held her hand still inside it, she felt no moving air. That was victory enough to keep working. People noticed pieces of the labor before they understood the shape of it. Mrs. Voss from the river road saw dirt darkening the snow near Martha's garden and asked if the privy had collapsed. Martha said, "No, Mom." Old Calvin Mercer, who had built 3 barns and therefore believed he understood every structure in the valley, warned her not to disturb the piers. "A floor can sag before a widow knows she's made a mistake," he said. Martha thanked him and kept carrying stone. At Foster's Mercantile, the clerk asked why she wanted extra lamp oil if she was short on flour. "For winter work," she said. He laughed. "Winter is not when folks start building." Martha paid with 2 silver coins she had meant to save. Winter had already started building against her. She was only answering. By early December, the hidden room was ready. Martha lowered a tick mattress through the opening, then 2 quilts, then a small shelf for a lamp. Then a thermometer Elias had kept in his toolbox, the kind with a cracked wooden back and numbers faded from rain. The first night she tested the chamber alone. The cabin upstairs was 34 degrees by morning. Inside the room, beneath the floor, the thermometer read 48. Martha sat in that stone pocket until the lamp burned low. Her breath did not fog. Her fingers did not sting. For the first time since the leaves had fallen, the cold was not chasing her. She did not move the children down that night. She was afraid to trust one reading, afraid to believe too soon, afraid that hope might make her careless. So she waited, and winter answered with the worst storm the valley had seen in years. It came on January 7th, at noon. The morning began with a gray sky and fine snow. By supper, the wind was driving ice so hard against the cabin that the walls sounded full of thrown sand. By midnight, the path to the woodpile had disappeared. By dawn, the drift against the north wall reached the window latch. The first day outside fell to 12 below zero. The second day, 21 below. The third night, Calvin Mercer's chimney smoked backward and filled his cabin with soot. The Voss family burned half a broken wagon box when their dry wood ran out. At Foster's, 2 men tore shelving off a storage wall to keep the stove from dying. Martha rationed her cedar carefully. But careful was not enough. On the fifth night of the storm, the fire in her stove had shrunk to red lines under ash. The cabin had dropped to 36 degrees. Frost crawled along the inside nails. Ruth's lips trembled while she slept. Ben woke crying because his feet hurt. Martha looked at the children. Then she looked at the trapdoor beneath the rug. The experiment was over. Now it was a decision. She wrapped Ben in a quilt and tied Ruth's shawl tight under her chin. She lowered the lamp first, then the blankets, then the children. Ruth climbed down slowly, one foot searching for each rung. Ben went after her, still half asleep. When Martha pulled the trapdoor shut above them, the storm disappeared. Not faded, not softened. Disappeared. There was only the tiny lamp, the smell of cedar, the stone walls, the sound of 3 people breathing in air that did not move. Martha hung the thermometer on a nail. 51 degrees. Outside, the wind was tearing branches off pine trees at 20 below. Ruth stared at the number. Ben touched the stone wall with his palm and whispered, "It isn't biting." That was how they survived the storm. For 6 days they slept under the floor. Martha climbed up twice each day, once at daylight and once before dark, to bank the stove, melt snow, and bring down food. Each time she opened the trapdoor, the cold fell in like water. Each time she closed it, the room recovered. They ate corn cakes, dried berries, and beans mashed cold from a tin cup. Ruth read from a primer by lamplight. Ben slept through 3 full nights without coughing himself awake. The chamber did not make winter gentle. It only made winter unable to finish what it had started. When the storm finally broke, the valley came out slowly. Doors opened into walls of snow. Men dug tunnels to their woodpiles. Women carried broth from house to house. Everyone counted fingers, toes, chimney cracks, and firewood. Mrs. Voss reached Martha's cabin on the second clear afternoon with a covered pot tucked under her coat. She expected sickness. She expected smoke. She expected the look people had after too many nights awake beside a dying stove. Instead, Ruth was sitting at the table with dry cheeks and warm hands. Ben was on the floor pushing wooden blocks across a strip of sunlight. The cabin was not hot, but it was steady. Mrs. Voss looked at Martha's woodstack through the window. "You still have cedar," she said. Martha nodded. "How?" Martha could have lied. She almost did. Then Ben lifted the edge of the rug and said, "We slept in Mama's ground room." Mrs. Voss stared at the trapdoor. Calvin Mercer came the next morning. He did not make a joke this time. He crawled halfway into the opening, looked at the stacked stone, felt the dry wall, saw the vent, and asked 3 questions with no pride left in his voice. How deep? How does the air change? How much wood did it save? Martha answered plainly. 4.5 feet below the floor. 1 narrow vent, small enough not to steal heat. Less than half the wood she would have burned, trying to force the cabin warm. The numbers traveled faster than the story. By the end of January, people knew Martha's children had come through the blizzard without frostbitten feet. They knew her chimney had not overheated. They knew her woodpile had not vanished. They knew the hidden chamber had held between 49 and 53 degrees, while the valley above fell far below zero. No sermon could have argued better than that. The first family to copy it was not the poorest. It was Calvin Mercer's. He dug beneath his own sleeping corner with 2 grown sons helping, and he built the walls exactly as Martha had done them, except wider, because he had the hands for it. When his wife spent one night below, she wept from relief and embarrassment, relief because it worked. Embarrassment because she had watched Martha carry stone for weeks and called it widow stubbornness. The Voss family could not dig beneath their cabin because water seeped too close to the surface. So Martha showed them another way. They cut into the bank behind the house and built a half-buried sleeping shed with stone sides, a timber roof, and earth packed over the back wall. It never warmed like Martha's chamber, but it stayed above freezing when the cabin did not. By the next winter, 5 homes near the river had some form of ground room. By the winter after that, 9 did. No 2 were identical. Some were narrow sleeping pits. Some were half cellars with bunks. Some served as food storage by day and shelter by night. One had a stone bench that held heat from a small covered coal pan. Though Martha warned against flame in a closed space until the venting was right, the principle stayed the same. Do not make the stove fight the sky alone. Let the earth carry part of the night. The change was not dramatic from the road. The cabins still looked poor. The chimneys still smoked. Snow still buried the paths. Children still hauled wood until their sleeves froze stiff. But inside those cabins, fear changed shape. Families stopped driving their stoves red hot until iron warped. They stopped burning chair legs before January was half finished. They stopped waking every hour to see if a child's hands had gone pale. The ground rooms did not make anyone rich. They made winter less powerful. In 1892, a traveling county surveyor saw one of the chambers and wrote a short note about it in a report on rural buildings. He did not call Martha an inventor. He did not call it new. He compared it to dugouts, root cellars, and the old earth lodges used long before settlers cut plank floors into the mountains. He was right. Martha had not invented the ground. She had remembered what comfort had made people forget. Air can turn murderous in a night. Earth changes slowly. That was the truth beneath the floor. Ruth grew up and built a small, earth-walled room under the back of her own cabin. Ben became a builder and refused to leave a raised floor open to winter wind. Whenever someone asked him where he learned that habit, he said his mother taught him that a house has 2 sides, the part the weather sees, and the part the weather does not. Martha kept the original chamber for the rest of her life. In summer, it cooled milk and stored apples. In winter, it waited under the rug, quiet and useful, with cedar still caught in the stone gaps. Visitors sometimes climbed down and laughed at how small it was. Then Martha would tell them what the thermometer read during the storm. 51 degrees under the floor, 20 below above it. 6 nights with children sleeping instead of shivering. Half the firewood saved when everyone else was burning furniture. After that, they stopped laughing. The room was not pretty. It was not modern. It was not even really a room, by the standards of people who had never feared a frozen floor. It was only a pocket of earth, stone, cedar, and a mother's refusal to let the wind decide who lived in her house. Martha Avery did not beat winter by building higher walls. She survived by looking beneath them. When the air turned against her, the ground held.